Hello, and welcome to High Performance Graphics 2020.
Just in case this is your first time at the conference, HPG is a graphics systems conference. We typically have material, both papers and invited talks on a range of subjects largely related to graphics performance systems. Some of these things are algorithms, compilers, languages, and a host of other things. So it's also a fairly mixed conference. You'll see representation from academia and industry, and the program itself is mixed between conference publications or journal publications and invited talks, as well as panel and posters. So HPG, this is the 12th HPG. We started out as a merger between the Graphics Hardware Conference and Ray Tracing Conference. So right around the late 2000s, programmable shading became a thing, and graphics hardware became much more flexible. And so software systems and performance systems on top of graphics hardware became a real topic in that community. And ray tracing was one of those applications, something up and coming that works really well on parallel hardware. And so those two logically merged into high performance graphics, which we do today. So, what's new this year? Obviously, this is a virtual conference, so this is our first virtual HPG. We have moved the format online in response to COVID, and so that's kind of obviously change number one. Change number two is that this year we have a tiered registration. So normally you register for the conference and show up. This year we wanted to provide a really wide range of accessibility to the conference, and so we chose to have a free tier. So if many of you have joined under that tier, we decided to do this really to provide as much exposure to the world and for our presenters here. So we also have a premium tier, which is a paid tier, which is actually fairly nominal, but it provides a little bit different, a little bit more of a conference environment. So we have that unlocks the ability to, say, ask questions and receive some of the really cool swag that we have. In addition to being online, we have had to change the format because not everyone is in the same place anymore. So the hours are necessarily a little bit different for the audience across the world. So we put it to be only 3 hours a day. So here on the west coast of the US, it happens from 9 to noon. That means in Central Europe, it's roughly 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. So in order to get all the content in, we did have to make it longer. So it's 4 days instead of 2. This is kind of obvious if you look at the schedule. And one other change that we made is that we added a student competition. We really wanted to get more students and creative work in, so we had that. They're going to be presented as posters, and a winner will receive a prize. So in order to make virtual conference work, we have some online tools. Notably, we are using Twitch, so most of you are probably watching this on Twitch. That is the primary video feed that we'll be using for the 4 days of the conference. In addition to Twitch, we will be using Slack as a real-time communication medium for asking questions and for interacting with community. So these are really the primary two tools that we'll be using for broadcast video communication and interactive text communication. Of course, we do have some scenarios where interactive video conversation is helpful or important, such as posters and live Q&A. So for that, we will be using Zoom. Most of the questions for the talk we do expect actually to come over Slack. We'll be setting up polls there so people can ask and up and down about questions. But after we've gone through all of the Slack questions, if there is time remaining, then we will do live Q&A on Zoom so that we can get some deeper questioning on some of the papers. So in addition to those, we also have our online digital tools. We do have our Twitter feed and the web page. If for whatever reason Slack is down and Twitch is down and you need to know what's going on, go to the webpage. I will post announcements there. Also, there's a calendar on the webpage, so that'll provide you the ability to click and introduce these to your calendar to block time. So I want to say thank you to all of our organizers. HPG really wouldn't exist without the work of a lot of people. We're all volunteers, and I want to thank everyone on this list for contributing. It really would have been, it was, definitely an interesting thing to help organize the conference, and then to have COVID happen, and then to have to reorganize the conference, and have people really jump in and step up to make this what it is. I also want to say extra double thank you to Jim and Pierre for running the streams. They are really wrangling the platform that you guys are watching on. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you off to, I think Josh is next to talk about, to thank our sponsors. So good to see you guys. Enjoy the conference.
Our sponsors play a critical role in making this conference possible. I cannot express enough gratitude for their flexibility this year as we move the conference online after most of them had already committed to the standard format. I'd like to give a special thanks to both Unity and Facebook Reality Labs. As nurturers, they play an especially important role in our financial success. The IHDs, Intel, Imagination, NVIDIA, and AMD have been reliable benefactors supporting the conference for years, decades in some cases. We also thank our corporate sponsors, Activision and the Kronos Group. Finally, the ACM and Eurographic serve as our legal and financial services sponsors, enabling us to sign contracts and publish the proceedings.
Hey, I'm Paul Ellis, and I am the diversity co-chair, or one of the diversity co-chairs for HPG. HPG now has a diversity program which aims at trying to encourage and enable students and professionals from underrepresented groups around the world to join us at HPG, attend the conference, and become a part of our community. The program provides a scholarship which covers the costs of all travel and lodging to and from the conference, and also the registration fees. The application is merit-based and is judged by a small committee of HPG members, HPG committee members, and some from the community. I guess that's all you need to know. Thanks for coming to HPG. Hope to see you next year, and spread the word. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Nishawa Chima and the other diversity co-chair of HPG. As Apollo already mentioned, we're hosting another diversity program this year following last year's success. I myself was actually a recipient last year, and now I'm a co-chair here. And for us, it was a great opportunity to connect with people in the industry, meet researchers, and present our work. And we hope that it's going to be a similar experience for you guys, despite the conference being online now. Unfortunately, due to that, we couldn't implement all the ideas that we had, but we hope that you still enjoy the conference. And we also hope that we inspire other conferences to implement similar programs so that people who are at a disadvantage can also be included in such conferences and communities and get a chance to some exposure. With this, I would like to welcome the 6 new recipients of this year who come from many different countries, including Pakistan, China, and South America. And we hope that you enjoy the conference.
Hi, I'm Jen Yüksel.
I'm Richard Member.
We are the paper chairs for HPG 2020. We have been extremely fortunate to work with such an amazing group of people organizing this virtual conference for you. The amount of effort and consideration went into preparing this conference can only be surpassed by the amount of work that our authors put into their research and preparing their HPG papers. HPG features some of the top research work at the intersection of high-performance computing and computer graphics. In spite of the challenging conditions related to the pandemic, HPG has received an exceptionally strong set of paper submissions this year. Of the 22 submitted papers, 12 of them got ultimately accepted, and this is a record high acceptance rate for HPG. The typical acceptance rate for HPG has been around 30% in the past years, though I should say that we do not target a particular acceptance rate at all. Each paper is reviewed and evaluated completely independently by the International Program Committee. So I would like to thank the members of the program committee listed here for all their efforts in reviewing the submissions and the valuable feedback they anonymously provided for improving them within a relatively tight review timeline. This year, we have made several important changes to the HPG's technical papers program. First of all HPG 2020 papers will be journal papers published in ACM's relatively new journal called Proceedings of the ACM on Computer Graphics and Interactive Techniques. This is different from recent years when only a portion of the papers were published in this journal and the rest of them were classified as short papers. As such, this year we have discontinued the short papers program as it was no longer needed. All HPG papers this year will be published full length without any page limits. I'm saying will be because the corresponding issue of the PACM CGIT journal has not come out just yet, but all papers are ready and registered attendees can access their preprint versions on our website. This year, we have also improved the review process by making it completely double-blind. That is, the reviewers did not know the identities of the authors, and of course the authors did not know who the reviewers were. Switching to double-blind review also led to some changes to the review process. The papers were reviewed by the program committee members only, without soliciting external tertiary reviews. Each paper had 5 or more reviewers, and the acceptance decisions were made by these reviewers following an online discussion process. We also shortened the review timeline such that we could announce the acceptance decisions merely a month after the paper submission deadline. I would like to acknowledge Victor Zorden, the editor-in-chief of the PACM CGIT journal, and Stephen Spencer, ACM SIGGRAPH's director for publications, for their assistance with these changes and the publication process. Most of all, I would like to thank everyone, who submitted their work to HPG. This conference exists because of your top-quality, cutting-edge research work. And we will enjoy the accepted papers throughout the conference, and I hope that the novel ideas in the other submissions will be published very soon. And of course, thank you all for joining us and following HPG 2020. I hope you will enjoy the technical papers program and the rest of the virtual conference. I can tell you that you are in for a treat. Thank you.
Who's doing introductions here?
All right. I think, Warren, can you hear me? I think we're ready to go.
I can. I could also do the 2 slides that I have for the program because I missed. I could also do the 2 slides.
Oh, go for it. That'd be great.
Host is disabled sharing. If we can enable sharing, I can share, or I can just send them, or we can do them afterwards. If you want to introduce Chris.
All right, Warren, if you're ready to go over the.
Oh, yep, here we go.
Okay, that'd be great, and then I'll introduce Chris.
Cool. Working?
Yep.
Cool. So I wanted to do a brief program before we introduce Chris. This was actually intended to be at the end of the pre-recorded thing, but it makes it feel a little bit more live if we're doing it here. So we have Chris Wyman, who's obviously speaking soon. Backwards. Chris Wyman, who will be speaking today on reframing light transport. Later, we'll have Holger to talk about fully ray-traced games. And Matt's going to be talking about porting PBRT to a GPU, which, given that I grew up on that book, at least in the ray tracing community, I am curious as to how you keep it still on a GPU. And after that, we've got Yasser Sheikh talking about photorealistic telepresence. This is something that I am excited to see outside of Facebook Reality Labs here. All the neural rendering that they're doing. We'd also talk about differential light simulation, why it's important, why it's hard. This is I guess I'll leave it to him to introduce why it's important at Hard, but it's something I'm also super excited about. And lastly, we have graphics, systems challenges and lessons, producing output for machines who may, in the long future, see more images than humans do as computer vision and computer training becomes more important. So without further ado, we can start with the first of our keynotes and introduce Chris Wyman. So I can stop sharing here.
All right, thanks, Warren. All right, well, I'm Aaron LaFawn, and along with Kayvon Fatalian, we are the program co-chairs, and it's my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Chris Wyman. Chris is a principal research scientist at NVIDIA in the real-time rendering research team. And prior to NVIDIA, Chris was associate professor at University of Iowa and earned his PhD at University of Utah. Chris's career over the last 20 plus years has this continued theme of bringing physically based light concepts, algorithms to real time, often well before they should have been possible. For example, Chris brought refraction and caustics to rasterization 15 years ago. And I think that still sometimes causes ray tracers fits when they see how the high quality of Chris's caustics from 15 years ago using a rasterizer. It just shouldn't have been possible. I'd say that Chris has a unique research style of that combines theoretical advances with both intuitive explanations and groundbreaking GPU implementations. One of these another example is Chris's i3D paper from 5 years ago, Freshman Trace Shadows, went on to become an NVIDIA product that went into games as NVIDIA's hybrid Freshman Trace Shadows, which ended up being the first fully ray traced dynamic shadows to ship in AAA games. Now that was one light, the sun, and that was hard shadows. That was 5 years ago. Fast forward to today, where Chris, along with Benedict Bitterly and a number of other co-authors, have a SIGGRAPH paper that shows how to render millions of dynamic area lights in real time with shadows from all of them. So for the past over 3 years, Chris has been pursuing various forms of unified physically based lighting in real time. And today's talk, he's going to share with us a collection of his insights and techniques he's discovered along the way. So over to you, Chris.
All right, thanks. Let's get my screen shared here. All right, hopefully you can see things now.
Yep, looks great.
All right, so thank you for the introduction, Aaron. Today I want to talk about reframing light transport for real time. And as Aaron said, this is some work that's been going on internally at NVIDIA with a number of co-authors. And I want to start off with, well, if I can hit, there we go. Start off with some thanks, or really in this case, this is a pretty image. And I want to start by saying that I'm going to use a backdrop of pretty images, and I do this in a lot of my talks, but this talk's a little bit different in that all of the images that you're going to see as backdrops and slides were captured in real time. And in this particular, and in all the cases, I'm using only 2 shadow rays per pixel. So this is real time dynamic lighting with moving lights. There's 3.4 million area emissive triangles in this scene that are dynamic, and we're running with 2 rays per pixel. And so all of the backdrops sort of fall in the same category, real-time captured 2 ray per pixel area lighting. So before getting into the talk, just to make sure I don't end up forgetting anyone at the end if I run out of time, I want to start with thanks. As Aaron said, this has been work that Benedict has really been leading as an intern and as in the past year back at Dartmouth. And I'd like to also thank the other co-authors in the paper, Wojciech, Matt, Pete, and Aaron. I also want to call out Kate Anderson, who's been an artist on our team, who's helped bring assets that really push the boundaries of what we can do in real time. And then as you've seen in this image, we've also been denoising things. There's been a bunch of people who've helped with denoising and additional research after the SIGGRAPH paper. So I really think now is an exciting time in real-time rendering. And the reason, well, there's many reasons for this, one of which is real-time ray tracing is here. We have hardware today, more hardware is coming out. Lots of people are looking forward to real-time ray tracing and it's starting to move into a lot of applications. But there's a big question in my mind and a lot of people's minds, what is it good for? And there's some obvious things that it's good for. You can just accelerate the computation of sort of traditionally offline renderers. Or in real time, people have been using it to do better shadows, AO reflections, and some first steps into global illumination. But moving to path tracing was really good for film. There's a lot of positives that can come out by going to ray tracing and path tracing. But unfortunately for real time, we can't necessarily rely on Moore's law to get us up to real time performance using the algorithms that people are running today in the offline space. And so I think it's really important to realize that there's a lot of space between just accelerating offline rendering and better shadows. And in order to get into that space, we're going to have to make sure to apply the constraints of real-time rendering to the general problems of ray and path tracing. And I talked a little bit about these constraints last year in an open problems talk at SIGGRAPH, but that was really a 30,000-foot bird's eye view of the problem. And it was sort of general platitudes that everyone can agree to. But today I want to talk about some specifics and some specific inspirations that were drawn from the work that we're publishing at SIGGRAPH and that's been going on internally at NVIDIA. So in particular, let's talk about what these constraints are, and then I'll dive into the details. It's really important in real time, and I'm speaking to the choir here at HPG, but it's really important in real time that we compute until we reach a time constraint, not a target quality. We have to fit this into a frame budget, and time to image is really a key metric, not quality. We'd like quality, but we need time to image first. And we need to include per frame data structure build costs in that. And as part of this interactive space, we really need tunable quality knobs so that our code can run on both consoles and high-end PCs with a tunable quality knob. We need to assume that the scenes are dynamic. We want the user to be able to go around, turn lights on and off, blow up walls, and otherwise change the environment in real time. And we want our solutions to be robust under this control. We also want this to be temporally stable. We don't want flickering blobs of noise that show up in front of the user as they're playing the game. They're not going to play the game very long if that happens. And we also, sort of related to temporal stability, we need to reuse spatial and temporally, either to reduce the cost of the frame or to increase the quality at a given cost. And something that's not necessarily a constraint, but something we have to keep in mind is ray and path tracing really brings in a lot of data and code divergence. And we need to manage that somehow so that we don't thrash our caches and otherwise treat our hardware badly. So part of the reason ray tracing and path tracing are popular and interesting is they tend to be brute force algorithms, and there's some beauty and elegance in simple brute force algorithms. But when you think about brute force, you have to be very careful moving that to real time. It's simply not possible for many problems. In the case that I've been very interested recently, you can't really expect to touch millions of lights for all the pixels on your frame for every frame and still get real time. And similarly, another hard problem is you can't expect to trace all the subsurface scattering paths through human skin or a cloud, even worse. This suggests we need some sort of stochastic technique. And of course, offline, they've been using stochastic techniques for ages, but we need to work to make this run in a streaming fashion to fully leverage GPU resources. So what if I told you that I found a, mathematical technique, speaking of statistics and probability here, a mathematical technique in a domain that integrates a non-analytic and in fact unknown function. This function happens to change during sampling in unknown and unknowable ways. And what's amazing to me is the sensor properties for the ground truth measurement are actually unknown. So when we're trying to form estimates, we're forming estimates of an unknown sensor. Yet they can use sampling rates as low as 1 in 10 to the 6th or 1 in 10 to the 7th, often with very poor quality, uncontrollable sampling distributions. But yet they get errors within a 3 to 5% margin of error. That's just amazing to me. And would that interest you as a rendering person? Now, let me tell you, this certainly interested me after I saw images like this, which is a rendering of mini light rendering using light BVH, which incidentally is state of the art. It was published last year at HPG. It's a great algorithm. This is just a very difficult case for it. And if you look at this image and say, could I get that with 3 to 5% margin of error? That would be truly astounding, and more like the work that we're publishing at SIGGRAPH, the restir algorithm. So you might ask, where can you find out more about this amazing mathematical technique? Well, and I'm just going to point you to political polling. And now you're going to laugh and scoff, but if you think about this, in political polling, you never know the collective ground truth. It changes day to day. The actual voting, who shows up depends on the weather and people's moods and, get out the vote efforts. But yet these political polls only use a few hundred to a few thousand samples, and they can take days or weeks to collect. And they often don't get to choose their samples. I certainly don't answer the phone most of the time. So they have to correct for whatever distribution they get. But yet, despite all of this, they're quite accurate, especially if you look at them, their actual vote percentages rather than the binary decision that they're predicting, because they're pre-filtering and then predicting after they pre-filter, which is never a particularly great way to estimate things. And there's some particularly interesting aspects of political polling that are also germane to real-time rendering. They do spatial and temporal aggregation to improve the predictive quality, which is really quite interesting. Now, of course, you might say, well, I don't really trust political polls. They're a bunch of bogus BS. But there's a variety of other applications that use statistics very extensively. In fact, in the US, there's over 100 federal agencies that collate statistics for things from census, employment, and economic indicators, the unemployment rate, resources, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And most of these are given with error much lower than 3 to 5%, which is even better than political polling, though of course they often use more expensive and principled sampling techniques with regularly validated measurements, which also sort of improves the confidence that we have that these statistical techniques are useful for us. Now, in this context of political polling and federal agencies, I want to particularly call out Statistics Sweden. If you guys decide to, get interested in this domain of statistics, you're going to find a bunch of articles from the Journal of Official Statistics, which is the Swedish open access peer-reviewed journal. And I've got to say, a lot of the statisticians that write there write supremely clear articles that don't require a PhD in statistics and the target domain. And I found these extremely valuable. So if you just decide to look into this, I really recommend, if you see a Statistics Sweden article, you read it. Now, what these statistical techniques do is they allow us to look and, to really try to achieve the promise of path tracing for real time. And I think one of the promises of path tracing for real time is it makes the assets easier to author. And just as sort of a programmer art example, this is Suzanne's Revenge. It's modeled from BlendSwap that's been hopping around the graphics community for a while. And the version I have has no emissive lights in it. And it took me 5 minutes to light it like this with the algorithms that we have now. Here's another example, the old city model, which is a really tired 8 or 10-year-old asset that I used quite a long time ago. And I went in and tagged a couple materials as emissive and added an emissive environment map. And it really changed the look. It almost looks, it almost looks modern, almost. And this is an asset I pulled from BlendSwap, and in a couple hours got quite an amazing result. And really the hardest part here was converting the model into the format that our prototype needed to consume. So let's talk about real-time rendering today. What are people doing and when they have insufficient resources? How do they get good-looking images? And most of you probably know the key thing that people do is they do some sort of spatial temporal reuse of work. And of course, this has been a long tradition in real-time graphics, going back to accumulation buffering, progressive rendering, irradiance and radiance caching, light probes, various anti-aliasing techniques do spatial and temporal reuse. And coming more recently, the denoising and reconstruction filters that are frequently used for ray tracing today, and adaptive sampling, and probably many more that I'm totally forgetting. But spatial and temporal reuse isn't just a real-time thing. People use it in offline context. I mean, if you think about it, path guiding is a type of spatial and temporal reuse, as is just radiosity and finite element methods generally. So let's think about what sorts of things get used, and this might give us some insights for how to do things better in real time. So commonly today, colors of various sorts are reused. Pixel colors for post-process filtering, texture colors in baked light maps, colors in other spaces, for instance, world space for irradiance volumes. One of the problems with colors, though, when you start to reuse it, is by the time you get around to the reuse, which is usually at the end of the frame or the next frame, you've lost most of the non-color information. And that means if you start filtering it, it's very easy to blur your visibility, to blur or lose entirely your specular highlights. And basically you're just adding bias because you don't know what to filter over, and you're filtering things that don't really belong together. Another thing that you could reuse, and I don't have a really good name for this, so I'm calling it projected radiance, is you sort of add a little bit more information to the color, give it some directionality, maybe a gradient, something like that. And examples of this are, pre-computed radiance transport, things like spherical harmonic coefficients, that sort of thing. And these are more expensive to compute or pre-compute, and they reduce some of the problems of reusing colors directly, but they're not fully eliminated because you're still sort of doing this at the end when you've lost a lot of the information that you might need to reduce the bias. You could reuse visibility, and we do this fairly commonly. Shadow maps are one form of that, form factors and radiosity, or even ambient occlusion if you think about filtering it in screen space. But of course, visibility is almost always binary, and reuse is a type of filtering. And so it's very hard not to blur by overfiltering or alias by underfiltering visibility. Other things you could reuse are ray segments. I mean, bidirectional path tracing does this, light field rendering does this. You could also reuse probabilities, in adaptive ray tracing or path guiding, or the random variates themselves in various primary sample space techniques. And these last three things have been less well explored in real time, and they tend to handle the issues from reuse a little bit better than reusing color directly. But there's this big question of how can you do this efficiently? So let's think about what is reuse doing and why is reusing computation reasonable? What reuse is doing is it makes some assumption, like given a small change in X, pixel space, the change in color or the change in Y is something. And that something is usually small, smooth, understandable, or something like that. But when this assumption breaks, that's when you get your artifacts. In the case of screen space filtering, you often get things like blurring, aliasing, lag, ghosting, halo, ringing, all the things that we sort of, we think about with post-process filtering. And this is generally bias and noise that's being added, usually bias. So I have an assertion. My assertion here, and I think this is a reasonable one that most of you will agree with. My assertion is that the artifacts are less correctable the later in the rendering process you try to deal with them. So if you're post-processing your final colors, you've lost most of the data you need to correct for broken assumptions, and many people try to add that back in using bilateral filtering or something that injects more information. And you have to do that because you've fundamentally lost that information already. If you do this earlier in the process, you may still have access to that information to help avoid these artifacts. Okay, so that means you should reuse information earlier in the renderer. And my suggestion is you do this as part of important sampling. And for those people who are fans of path guiding, this is not really a surprise, but for others, let's talk about why. One reason is that the importance sampling function can be nearly arbitrary. You can, as long as you have a function that's well chosen, it will improve the convergence of your Monte Carlo integration. And that means you get a bang for buck increase, and your quality is better at the same ray cost. Worst case, if you choose poorly this importance sampling function, you'll add noise, and that's a bang for buck decrease. But if you have good reuse assumptions, whenever those assumptions hold, you'll improve your quality significantly. And sure, in a few places your assumption will break. And in those cases, the pixels will become noisier. But you can probably still apply post-process anti-aliasing after the fact in order to deal with those pixels. So that's my assertion. You should reuse earlier in the renderer. And so let me suggest this reuse assumption. Nearby pixels have a similar probability to select a given light sample. So this is the assumption used in our direct lighting algorithm from SIGGRAPH this year. But you could probably replace nearby pixels with nearby texels or nearby voxels, and you could probably replace light sample with path vertex to have a similar assumption for more general problems. And this really suggests that what you want to do is reuse your neighbor's importance sampling function. You might ask, what does this even mean? And I would suggest that what that means is if you construct a per pixel sampling PDF, you're going to aggregate them to improve quality. That might be one way to move forward. So if we're going to think about that, let's talk about importance sampling for a moment. So I want to remind you that importance sampling is vital, and most of you probably know this, but it's especially vital for real-time rendering. So if you have your integral that you're sampling using Monte Carlo integration, right, your importance sampling, the density that you sample according to P, if you use a better one, it means this integral, this estimate converges faster, and you need fewer samples N for convergence. And this is really, truly vital to minimize in real time. If you can only afford to send 2 or 3 or 4 rays per pixel, if that, you better hope that N here can be 2 or 3 or 4, which means you better have a darn good sampling PDF P. So that suggests an idea. Maybe we should target perfect importance sampling where P is proportional to F. After all, if you do that, that is going to reduce your samples needed down to 1. Now, of course, when importance sampling is usually taught, this idea is hand-waved away. It's sort of laughed at. And in fact, when I taught importance sampling, I did this as well. But let's actually do a little bit of a thought experiment here and think about what would perfect importance sampling mean, and should we really ignore it out of hand? So if P is proportional to F, so we're doing perfect importance sampling, that means P equals some normalization constant C times F. And since for any PDF, the integral of P needs to be 1, it's easy to show that this constant C is 1 over the integral of F. And this is where the hand waving usually begins. To quote from a book that many people trust, the 3rd edition of PBRT, this is where the text goes and said, of course, this is ludicrous, since we wouldn't bother using Monte Carlo if we could integrate F directly, which makes a lot of sense. But let me suggest to you that if we're doing Monte Carlo integration, why should an integral inside our numerical approximation bother us? I mean, if there's an integral there, we're already numerically approximating it. We probably don't need that integral particularly accurately. Why don't we just approximate it too with Monte Carlo integration? So that brings us to resampled importance sampling, or RIS. And I informally think about it, sort of my mental model of RIS is approximately perfect importance sampling. And you'll see why in a moment. So imagine you have an unnormalized function p hat that you want to use for importance sampling. And of course, for perfect importance sampling, this will be equal to F. So first of all, you need to normalize it to get your density by dividing by the integral of p hat. And now you could say, well, I didn't know the integral of p hat. That's a problem. So you approximate it using a Monte Carlo estimate. Now we can plug p back into our Monte Carlo estimator, and you get this. And this equation here happens to be exactly the resampled importance sampling estimator. And I highly recommend you go see Talbot et al. SIGGRAPH, or excuse me, an EGSR paper from 2005. So what is resampled importance sampling? It's actually interesting. I looked through a number of books and textbooks and tutorials and courses, and this is not well covered in most of the graphics community, and I certainly didn't learn about it in school. If you want to learn about RIS, I recommend you go to Talbot's paper or his PhD dissertation, which I think both explain it quite clearly. But here is the RIS estimator. And what's going on here, a good way to think about this is you're taking M samples from a distribution Q, right? This sum in here, this is an integral, and the importance, the distribution you're sampling from is Q. That distribution is a cheap, low quality, or simply bad distribution, and you take a bunch of samples M from it, and you turn it into N samples from an unnormalized distribution Q here. And this distribution, or excuse me, a distribution P hat. This distribution P hat is complex, high quality, hard to sample, or maybe impossible to sample analytically. And typically how this works is N is much less than M, and these N samples that you take out here for your final estimate become higher quality the closer, meaning closer to P hat, as M goes to infinity, because then, of course, this turns into that integral. And so if you think about this, when M is equal to 1, a lot of this nonsense cancels away and you just have F over Q. And so this is equivalent to importance sampling using the distribution Q. And if M equals infinity, this turns into an integral, and this is equivalent to sampling directly from the normalized distribution P hat. Now you might, realistically ask, why am I dragging you through all this math? And the reason is there are some benefits, some really important benefits to use RIS for real-time rendering. So imagine you have a more complex function here, S times V, and I've chosen these names carefully. You might imagine S as the shading and V as the visibility, and you might pick your target function P hat to only be part of the integrand. So you might pick P hat equals the shading term S. And then you can see that some of this sort of cancels away. If I hand wave, cancels away, and you get this equation here. And an important thing to notice about this is this cleanly decomposes the integral into pieces that get evaluated at different frequencies. And this is very, very valuable if the cost of V is more expensive than the cost of S. Or if it's the other way around, if S is more costly than the cost of V, you could swap these. But what this does for real-time rendering is if we can cheaply compute a shade or a shade approximation, we can use those to determine where we should shoot our rays. And the more of these cheap shades we test, the better our quality of the rays, the end rays that we shoot. Now, we can do this multiple times, and this is something that I haven't seen before in the graphics literature, or if so, it's not well known. So this is the integral for the full rendering equation using the area formulation we use for direct lighting. The BRDF times a geometry term times incident light times visibility. And if you pick P hat as the BRDF times the geometry term times the light, you get this thing here that looks like this. But this thing here, this normalization factor for P hat, is still a legitimately hard integral evaluated with Monte Carlo. Maybe we should just apply RIS again to get a good function P to sample this with. So you might imagine using a second target function P of the geometry term times the lighting. And if you do that and stick in another RIS estimator here, you get something that looks like this, and some of these things cancel out, and you get something that looks like that. And of course, it's pretty easy now to sample Q proportional to the intensities of the light, which allow you to get further cancellation. And if you look at what's going on here, you've now split the numerical integration into several pieces. V, the BRDF, the visibility of the BRDF, the geometry term, and potentially the lighting are all evaluated with different sampling rates. And that seems like something that could be extremely powerful. So for those of you who haven't learned RIS or haven't taught it before, let me suggest why you should maybe change that. So, and this is really just a summary, a takeaway of all of that math, right? RIS allows you to convert M cheap samples into N ones of better quality, which allows you to sample from nearly arbitrary functions in an unbiased way. My mental model here is this is an approximate perfect importance sampling. And as M goes to infinity, you approach this perfect sampling distribution. One of the really key things for real time and for designing algorithms generally is RIS allows you to apply it in multiple stages, which gives you lots of flexibilities. Which order do you do what? What's more costly here? What scale, what space do you do this computation in? And it decouples the computational frequency so you can use cheap to compute terms to improve the quality of your expensive operations. And I think that's a really key takeaway here. So now I've talked about this approximately perfect importance sampling, and to get good results, that suggests you want M, the number of candidates that you use for your RIS, to go to infinity. So let's imagine we pick M of 10,000, and we want to just pick one sample. There's an interesting question here. Do you want to keep all of those 10,000 candidates resident in memory? Because if you do, that's going to limit how far you can crank up N if you have to store it all in memory and process it. Most people today keep the candidates resident when they do RIS. I've looked at a bunch of people's RIS implementations, and this tends to be the way people do it. They'll take a bunch of samples, compute a discrete CDF, and invert them, using a bisection method or maybe a straightforward linear search through the candidates to pick the one that they want. But if you're going to keep if you're going to look through 10,000 samples just to pick one, do you really want to keep those all in memory? Why not try to discard them incrementally and just keep the one or the N that you need? And this brings us to another algorithm called weighted reservoir sampling. And if you don't know weighted reservoir sampling, do yourself a favor and go learn it. If you do know weighted reservoir sampling, do yourself a favor and keep this at the very top of your toolbox. I think this algorithm is going to be really important moving forward for stochastic techniques in real-time rendering. What is it? What is weighted reservoir sampling? It's a well-known algorithm from the early 80s, back in the day when data was stored on reel-to-reel tapes. And it was a big pain in the ass if you needed to rewind your tape halfway through your algorithm so you could do a second pass over the data. And so people were naturally very interested in coming up with alternate ways of dealing with this. And so weighted reservoir sampling is a streaming selection of elements from an arbitrary weighted stream. So you can have elements with arbitrary weights, and you can pick according to their proportional weights using weighted reservoir sampling in a streaming fashion. It does one pass over the data, so there's no need to rewind, or in our case, there's no need to keep them in memory. And the size of your stream doesn't need to be known in advance. So this is great for real-time rendering. If you only have time for 64 random samples, so M equals 64, great. If you have time for more, you could turn it up to 128 or 1,000 or 1,000,000, and you could just keep running the algorithm without changing the code at all. And it's constant memory. So if you're going to return one sample, you only need a reservoir of size 1. Now, this is an easy proof by induction. Many people have actually reinvented this wheel, including myself. But you should really go read up on the 40 years of theory that follow the initial papers, because there's some really interesting aspects to this. But it's so simple that we can sort of prove it here on a slide via induction. If you want to understand what weighted reservoir sample is, you have a stream of samples. You pick the first one with weight greater than 0. A new one comes in, and you're going to pick the new purple one with proportional weight, the weight of the purple one over the total weights of the stream. And then each time a new element comes in, you do the same thing. Pick this with proportion, the weight of the orange one over the total weight of the stream, and the weight of the red one over the total weight of the stream. And really, this is just an argument about proportionality, meaning the weight of the purple element to the weight of the green one, that ratio stays the same throughout the stream. And so once you've sampled proportionally between those two elements, you can keep that proportion very easily by just stealing uniformly from the entire stream. And when your stream stops, you just output the current selection as the final answer. And so this is a simple algorithm that only needs 2 things at any given step: the sum of the prior weights and the new element, the weight of the new element that you have on the stream. And if you go back to thinking about RIS, this is exactly what you need for resampled importance sampling. You have a sum of the prior weights, and you have a new element weight down here. So weighted reservoir sampling is very simple, but also very powerful. It allows you to do RIS without the memory limiting your sample count. So the memory is O of n, and for real time, n is generally a small constant, like 1 or 2 rays per pixel. Unfortunately, this is still order m compute, and we want m to go to infinity. But it turns out that weighted reservoir sampling provides another benefit that allows us to address this aspect as well. So weighted reservoir sampling allows you to combine 2 independent streams of samples, but the key aspect of this is you don't need to reprocess the individual samples. So if you've processed stream 1 here and you pick this orange sample, and you process stream 2 and pick this gray sample, to process and get one sample from the combined stream, you just have to look at the orange and the gray sample that you picked and choose them with this, this relative weight. And this gives you a sample with density according to the, a PDF according to the entire stream, which is great. Because this is great because it allows us to do the spatial and temporal reuse that we need for real time. So now let's get down to an example and say we have this image here. This is our amusement park with 3.5 million lights. And at each pixel, let's say we use RIS. We sample 32 of these lights randomly and pick one based on those 32 random samples based on RIS, so according to their weights. You get something that looks like that, which isn't bad, but it's not particularly great. So you might say, well, hey, I've got a bunch of neighbors. Each of those also have reservoirs, which means each pixel, my neighbor, also has 32 random samples, and they're probably unique. So if I reused from them, I might get, over a 5x5 region, I might get 25 times 32 effective samples, so 800. And if you swap back and forth, you can see that image improves in quality quite a bit because now M has increased from 32 to, around 800. Now, you could also say, well, hey, I have a frame from last frame. It also had 800 effective samples per pixel. Why don't I merge with it? And now I have 1,600 effective samples per pixel. And that gives us another big boost in quality. Now, an interesting thing about spatial and temporal reuse is there's multiple ways of doing it. And so you might imagine doing temporal reuse prior to your spatial reuse. So up here you had 32 random samples, and last frame you had 800 effective samples per pixel. Maybe you merge those guys together to get 832 effective samples, and then you do your 5x5 neighborhood merge, and that gives you over 20,000 effective samples per pixel. And if you look, that gives you, a significant improvement in quality. And of course, once you start doing temporal reuse, you're not just really reusing from last frame, because last frame reused from the frame before, which used from the frame before, which reused from the frame before. And at this point, it becomes very, very difficult to enumerate the number of effective samples that you're using for any given pixel. In fact, one of the things we had to be careful of in our code is not to overflow a 32-bit integer that was counting M. So it's important to understand that every time we merge these reservoirs, it's actually a new application of resampled importance sampling. And this gives us a lot of flexibility, but it's also a big challenge because the design space is huge. You need to ask, what is your target function p hat at each one of these steps? You might pick a different function every step. However, it does give you a lot of flexibility because this is importance sampling. P hat doesn't need to actually be a physically correct anything. It can just be a function that gets you closer to your target distribution and gives you less noise in your samples. So for instance, you could use an SSAO term to approximate visibility to reduce the noise in your samples. And I think this is fascinating that you might be able to use raster hacks to improve the quality and convergence of your ray tracing in an unbiased way. I think that's an amazing notion. Another thing to consider for the design space is where are these candidate samples stored? So for our SIGGRAPH paper, we worked in screen space, but you could imagine storing samples in texel space for light map baking. You could think about it in world space for multi-bounce effects. You could think about it in Froxel space, or there's probably a dozen other coordinate spaces you could think about doing RIS to improve the quality. Another question is what sampling PDF should you use for your initial samples? We're using fairly naive sampling, but you might imagine doing something more sophisticated here. I think it's an important question to think about upsampling and downsampling these reservoirs to change the spatial compute frequency. For instance, in games today, people often render images at half or quarter res. So can you store these reservoirs at half or quarter res and then upsample their contributions over the entire image? That would save more time. There's a question of which neighbors to reuse and which neighbors specifically not to reuse. And this is an important question, not only for avoiding bias, but also for avoiding noise and just generally improving the sampling quality. And of course, we've sort of shown an existence proof for direct lighting with many, many lights, but I think this scales to not only GI, but longer path lengths. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to sort of push this forward. And of course, one thing that you may not have realized in the talk this far, because it's been sort of fast, is the sampling distributions from neighboring pixels can be quite different. And this can affect the quality. It can introduce bias, but it can introduce problems in other ways. And we have not looked at this particularly carefully. We've found ways to eliminate the bias, but I think there's other ways that differing PDFs and neighboring pixels affect sampling quality. And it's important to think through that process and figure out how to solve that. So now I want to explore a particular design space that we looked at in our work, which is visibility. And of course, visibility is often one of the most important, expensive, and ignored aspects of real-time rendering. And so I picked this particularly old model because it has a lot of challenging visibility. So this is the Berkeley Soda Hall model with 20 to 40 distinct rooms per floor, 6 different floors in total, 50,000 emissive triangles split into every single different room has unique lights. And so not all of the lights are visible in any given room. So there's a lot of visibility. And what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in around here and look at some results. So this is an image with no visibility at all, and it doesn't look particularly good, as you can imagine. So this is using all 50,000 plus lights, giving a color at every pixel. Now, this is where you can start asking questions. Where do you inject visibility into this iterative RIS process? And an obvious answer is at the end, right before you shade. And we definitely do that. But let's think about another possibility as well. Maybe we inject visibility before we do spatial temporal reuse. So what I mean here is we compute 32 candidates per pixel, and before we start reusing that light sample, we first shoot a shadow ray towards the selected light. And we then only reuse the samples between nearby pixels if they were visible. And once you do this, you get an image that looks like this, and it's a significant difference. And one of the things to notice here is that the lights that are contributing to the scene generally here are largely only the ones in this room. And the light over here is contributed mostly from the light in this room off the hallway. And there's in fact some dark regions here where no lights are really contributing. And so what's going on here is you've already introduced almost a potentially visible set for lights. And then, of course, if you add shadow rays at the end after reuse, you get results like this. And if you flip back and forth a few times, you can see that what these shadow rays after reuse are doing is they're adding sort of contact shadows, the things that show that this chair are actually touching the ground. And so this is really interesting because reusing statistics via RIS still allows you to do computation based on signal frequency. Really what's going on here with visibility is these global shadow rays are giving you the benefits of a light PVS, and then the shadow rays after reuse are giving you the local sort of contact shadows. And that's a really interesting observation that depending on where in this reuse you inject information, you get results with different frequencies. And so you can leverage that to do some interesting things, I think. So we've talked through the math of resampled important sampling, and a lot of people that I've talked to internally and at NVIDIA and talked about this have not been real convinced by the math. And so let's talk about another way to abstract this problem to maybe understand what's going on. So typically when we do rendering, we need to accelerate certain sampling processes. Say we need to select a light to shoot our shadow ray to. And typically this is done with some sort of acceleration structure, something like a tree. And for instance, the light BVH, what you're going to do is you're going to deterministically build a tree, something like this. And then for the blue pixel here and the red pixel here, you're going to traverse down this tree in a stochastic way, with the blue pixel more likely picking children to the left, and the red pixel more likely picking children to the right as it traverses down the tree. And so you might get samples like this, the blue one here, which isn't necessarily the most likely one, but it's a pretty likely light for this blue pixel. And in this case, that light probably is the most likely one for the red. And this traversal is randomized to make sure you sample all the lights here for the red pixel with the appropriate distributions. Now, another way to think about this is the statistical approach, the streaming RIS approach. And in this case, no structure is built in advance. You just have a list of lights. And each pixel starts by randomly selecting candidates. So here, this blue guy picks these 4, and this red guy picks these 4. And these are independent samples, and they may overlap. So 2 adjacent pixels may overlap. And then when you're going to shade just one of them, you're going to go through the 4 candidates for the red pixel, evaluate the likelihood of selecting each one, and pick them proportional to the likelihood. And so maybe you pick this one for the red one, and this one for the blue one. Now, it's interesting to sort of do a comparison between these, because the tree-based approach, you're building this structure for dynamic lights, or rebuilding it every frame even. And so that might be order n log n, say, whereas the statistical approach may have no upfront costs other than making sure your lights are in the right position. The tree has random memory reads because you're doing the stochastic traversal. Well, the stochastic approach also has random memory reads for the candidate selection. However, the tree is doing dependent memory reads as you go down parent, child, parent, child, parent, child. Whereas in the statistical approach, all of these are independent memory reads. You could possibly do them all in parallel. And with a tree, these can be divergent because you might go separate ways down the tree. The tree may not be fully balanced. Whereas in the stochastic approach, this is a fixed cost with a set number of candidates. Although, to be fair, the set number of candidates may be larger than the traversal in the tree case. So there's a bunch of interesting takeaways that I've taken from this process, and I hope you've gathered. So both of these algorithms here rely on randomization, and that means they're actually both examples of a randomized algorithm. And this is actually interesting. This is an area where my knowledge of computational theory is a little bit lacking. There are different classes of polynomial time algorithms with and without randomness. And it's unclear if these classes are identical. There's thoughts, but it's unclear. And this actually suggests that the characteristics of randomized algorithms are slightly different than the characteristics of deterministic algorithms. And as a rendering community, I think it's important to think about whether we can leverage the statistics of randomized, or the properties of randomized algorithms to help us. And we should think about this explicitly because we're already using randomized algorithms widely in rendering today. When people are taught randomized algorithms, the canonical example is quicksort. A second canonical example is the Monte Carlo method, which we use all the time. But of course, the light sampling acceleration structures many of us use, this streaming RIS, those are both randomized algorithms as well, as are neural networks. And so a lot of the important algorithms we're using to do real-time rendering today are based on randomization. And I think it's important to be able to analyze that and think through that clearly so we can design the most efficient algorithms for our purposes. Another interesting theory is another interesting takeaway is there's a lot of statistics theory to mine. RIS is a form of sampling importance resampling, which is the name in statistics, which is related to rejection sampling, bootstrap filters, and particle filtering. And once you start adding reuse, it seems like there's some relationship with sequential Monte Carlo and population Monte Carlo methods. And there's rich statistics literature to go read up here. And I think there's a lot of insights that we can take for real-time rendering. There's also some interesting properties of weighted reservoir sampling that I think we need to look at. We're using an independent sampling form. There's also dependent sampling form if you're interested in that sort of sampling technique. And there's actually an alternate form of weighted reservoir sampling that's hard to understand when you first see it. It uses randomized exponentiated weights. And it triggers this thought in my mind, is this related to things we can use for participating media? Another takeaway, which has been sort of a theory of mine, but it's sort of been proven out in this work here, is data structures builds take a lot of time, and we should maybe rethink some of them, right? For data structures, we need to build it. That's costly. We need to maintain it. It's costly. We might be building and maintaining things we're not using in a given frame. That's wasteful. We need dependent reads for traversal for almost any data structure. That's costly. They may be varying costs, so you have incoherence, and sometimes the traversal itself is stochastic. And so this really leads you to this question: do we want a deterministic data structure, or maybe we should build some randomized data structure that avoids a lot of these problems? I mean, why build a deterministic thing and then stochastically throw bits out? Why not build something stochastically? It may not have all the data you could want, but you're going to traverse it in a very deterministic way. And this is more of an ideology than a concrete idea, but this iterative RIS that our SIGGRAPH paper demonstrates starts to resemble this sort of structure. And I think it's interesting to ponder that a little bit further. And really, I was reading this paper by Lin and Yüksel from i3D this year, and noticed this paragraph and realized that what our work is doing is really taking this to the extreme. So their goal in the real-time stochastic light cuts paper is to minimize the light tree construction and light sample selection times. And they say, well, we're going to do stuff that might reduce the quality of the tree, but we're going to get around this by using more samples. And really what we're doing here is taking that to the extreme. We're building a tree that's so loosely it's almost not recognizable as a tree, but the samples are really, really cheap. It definitely impacts the sample quality. Each sample is, almost a naive thing, but we're using maybe 100,000 or more of them per pixel, and that really offsets that change in quality. So with that, I want to wrap up. So real-time ray tracing is here today, but maybe traditional CPU algorithms are not best suited for GPU-based stream processing. I mean, would you use the same sorting algorithm that you do on the CPU and GPU? Maybe you shouldn't use the same rendering algorithm on the CPU and the GPU. And we need to think through that. And now is actually a really good time to rethink our approach and optimize performance, because we have a big chance with ray tracing moving into games. The constraints of game ray tracing are very different than the constraints of film. And you don't necessarily have the expectation of a full global illumination model with high quality caustics and participating media and all this stuff. You can insert things a little bit more incrementally, which allows you to focus very clearly on the performance of each step, and then think about how to generalize that as you scale up. And really, I think I had three big theses in this talk. First of all, remember that this is more of a reminder. Remember the real-time constraints; they're really important. Rethink complex data structures, and consider streaming statistics and PDFs rather than today we stream triangles and rays. And there's likely other ways to reframe this problem. This is a way that makes sense to me. I think there's a lot of runway for it on this, but there's probably other ways to reframe this problem. And because people are starting to do ray tracing in games and other interactive applications, they'll be beating down your doors, particularly if you're a student. Come up with this algorithm, they'll be beating down your doors to try this out. So I really encourage you to think about problems in this direction. So with that, thank you. I'm open to take questions.
All right, Chris, you'll have to imagine the applause.
All right.
I've got a few questions here. First one is, could you talk more about dynamic scenes? How much temporary reuse over how many frames is typically required to get the kind of high quality results that you're showing?
It's a good question. So The reuse, I would say you need a couple frames before things start to converge. Yeah, maybe 5, 6, 7. But generally, I mean, unless things are moving really, really fast, like, you know, a sphere and the entire sphere moves to a novel location. So you have this sphere hole in your scene. You just have a few pixel disocclusions around the boundary, you know, maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 pixel disocclusions. And those fill in, and then you can denoise them pretty well right at the start, especially with spatial reuse, right? We're not just relying on temporal. Temporal is very, very important, but the spatial reuse allows you to steal some of the multitude of samples from neighbors that weren't disoccluded. Yeah.
If I can add to that, from having seen this in motion, is it right to say that when things are moving quickly, what you end up with instead of a blur is more noise in those regions?
Well, yeah. Well, I think there's a trade-off there. If you don't run a denoiser on this thing, you definitely end up with more noise where disocclusions happen. And then your denoiser that you apply on top of it may end up having to blur a little bit more in those regions in order to not have temporal flickering and popping. So what you're saying, Aaron, is correct and incorrect depending on whether you're running a denoiser on top, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Next question is about the applicability of this to offline. The question is, I know the techniques you described here are focused on for real time, I'm paraphrasing, but could they be adapted to offline rendering? For example, RIS in path tracing, bidirectional path tracing, metropolis light transport, et cetera.
So yes, I think the answer is yes, definitively. There are some interesting questions related to how you move this to offline. In particular, we didn't talk about this much in the talk, but I want to emphasize again something I said a moment ago. The temporal reuse is a really, really vital component of this. And this is a little bit more challenging in offline, where sometimes frames are rendered on a farm where each frame may be totally independent of the frames before them. And part of what gives this the power is we're using last frames, which, you know, we had on the same GPU to inform the sampling probabilities for this frame. And if you can't do that, you may have to rely more on spatial reuse, or you may have to process sequences of frames within the same, you know, set of CPUs, say, so that you have access to that data. But I think the answer is yes, this can be applied in offline, but I haven't thought too deeply about it.
Well, it's also, it seems like in offline, the RIS has been used in the non-streaming fashion.
Yes, that's correct.
Applying this streaming fashion could, so in some ways, yeah, that seems directly applicable. Okay, next question. You mentioned that when a reservoir sampling is applied is causing bias, but where does the bias come from? I don't see the bias in the math.
Yeah, so the bias is a bias from importance sampling. So importance sampling is unbiased as long as your density P is non-zero whenever the function f that you're integrating is non-zero. And so if you imagine in excuse me, in a screen space sharing space, you might have one pixel with normal like this and one pixel with normal like this. And if you reuse between them, the pixel with normal like this only covers half the hemisphere of the other guy. And so that means you're putting zero values for the integrand in regions where it's non-zero, and that's what causes the bias. And actually, this is what causes ringing and haloing with post-process denoising filters. It's the same assumption that's baked into the processing of color. It's just, it's much more pronounced. Well, it's not pronounced. It's much more explicit why that's occurring when you do it with importance sampling, whereas it's not necessarily clear why that bias comes in when you're filtering, post-filtering the image.
I have a question for you, Chris. And by the way, I am running long into the break. We started, Chris, a little bit late, so I'm going to eat into that break. So we're getting a number of good questions. But we will have a short break, and we will start after the break right on time. So we'll keep them a little bit longer. Chris, you mentioned other possible uses, and I'll ask you more about this. Denoising and temporal AA and these and the like are doing spatial temporal reuse of colors. And with Riester, you're describing reuse of light probabilities. What do you think some of the other quantities and portions of the rendering equation are ripe for investigation, kind of similar style, now that you've sort of broken us free of being limited to colors?
Well, I mean, I'd like to think that everything could be done this way. I mean, that's sort of a really crazy and ambitious notion. And I think there's a lot of challenges getting there. But I mean, could you do? Does this apply to allow you to do rendering of particles and volumes? Say, does this extend to visibility? Does this extend to GI? Does this extend to caustics? I don't even know what some of that means because I haven't thought through it all. But I think there's a lot of interesting directions this could go.
All right. Well, are there any questions on Zoom? This is a good chance for us to test this. I believe you can simply unmute yourself if you are logged into Zoom and want to ask Chris a live question. I'll take a minute, pause, and see if there's anyone who wants to ask Chris a live question.
I'll just go ahead and ask Chris, are the slides going to be available online or no?
Yeah, I'll make the slides available.
Cool.
Okay, I'll do one more call for live questions. All right, well, we'll end it there. Well, Chris, thanks for the great talk, and thanks for kicking off HPG.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
What's the restart time?
We'll restart at 10:25, I believe. I'm double checking right now the program. Yes, we'll restart with next invited talk from Holger Gruen from Intel at 10:25 and paper start at 10:45. So take a short break and I'll see you back here in a few minutes.
Enjoy.
right. Yeah, we should. Okay, I'm going to stop because I'm listening now. All right. So am I live now? All right, great. So I'd like to introduce the second speaker today, which is Holger Gruen from Intel. And so Holger's talk is going to be pre-recorded. So we're going to play the video, and then Holger will be available for Q&A. And so we will be watching the Slack channels and other sources for Q&A. So Holger is a longtime graphics engineer and developer at Intel. And one of the big things about this talk is that getting ray tracing into real-time games is going to be a lot more than just fast ray tracing or fast BVH build. We need to have total system integration of these techniques, and those are some of the topics that Holger is addressing in his talk. So I'll let the talk go, and we'll be back in about 20 minutes for Q&A.
Hello and welcome to this keynote. My name is Holger Gruen. I'm a principal engineer and I work within the HPG Technology and Research Group. Hello and welcome to this keynote. My name is Holger Gruen. I'm a principal engineer and I work within the HPG Technology and Research Group at Intel. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is whether we are done with hardware ray tracing. Basically, the question I want to ask is, should we just rely on GPUs getting fast and be done with it? Or are there ways where we can make real-time ray tracing more pervasive in games through some architectural changes? So don't get me wrong, ray tracing hardware is great and I'm a fan of ray tracing. So it's really cool because it solves real-time problems rasterizations can't simply solve efficiently, right? Recent DXR games have shown a variety of fantastic ray tracing effects, and they've definitely raised the quality bar for real-time rendering. Also, there's great progress with regards to denoising, so it's all good news. The problem is, though, that ray-traced rendering is not just about tracing rays. There's the whole complex of BVH management, issues with build, refits, and potential streaming of BVHs. I mean, we don't really have ways to stream BVHs the same we would stream, let's say, texture tiles. Then another thing that comes into the way of really great performance is, or can be, hit point shading. And that's usually a SIMD utilization issue. We'll talk about this as well. So as a result to these limits, I mean, current AAA games need to limit the amount of ray tracing they can do. So this talk really is about open problems that need to be overcome. And by this, I mean, this is really beyond just making GPUs faster, which would obviously speed up things, right? But I'd like to discuss things that perhaps we can overcome in a similar way that we've overcome traversal performance problems by adding traversal hardware. So let's take a step back and think about what rasterization can do and what many AAA games do. They push thousands of uniquely on-the-fly skin characters. Not every game does, but some do. They push animated forests with alpha-tested foliage. They do highly programmable instancing. A good example of that one would be, let's say, the Unreal Engine 4 kite demo. The new DirectX 12 mesh shader stage can generate really, really small geometries and thousands of them on the fly. Also, dynamic geometry gets tessellated on the fly on the GPU. And finally, if you've seen the Unreal Engine 5 demo video, it seems that we will see massive amounts of virtual geometry that gets streamed and decompressed on the fly. So what about ray tracing? Can it do all these things as well? Let's just look at a very simple sample with very common animated objects. So let's look at a scene with about 90 million triangles. It has 100 uniquely skinned characters and 100 uniquely animated trees. If I rasterize this scene, it can be done, or a G-buffer laydown can be done in about 2.7 milliseconds, but the overall ray tracing cost here is a lot higher, and that's not necessarily the cost of tracing rays. It's more the additional cost of basically streaming out the animated vertices and then feeding these into bottom level acceleration structure updates. Now, many people will say, yeah, but you can overlap with this with, let's say, G-buffer rasterization or shadow map drawing. But then, I mean, the whole point of this is to make ray tracing more pervasive. So we can't really rely on big rasterization workloads to overlap with computer-aided animations or bottom-level acceleration structure updates. So let's talk about these BVH-related issues. One issue is definitely building and refitting costs. So BVH updates just don't scale like streamed rasterized geometry. In this example here, in the small picture below, you see 225 skin characters, 20K triangles each. And you can see here by the millisecond numbers I show here, that rasterization can deal with them really efficiently, whereas just the animation and BVH refit cost is a lot higher than that. The same thing is true for animated trees. Again, I'm just using these 100 animated trees. And you can see here that, again, animation refits come in at quite a high cost when compared to rasterization. And keep in mind, rasterization does all the animations, all the skinning as well. So for games that push even more dynamic geometry than that, and that's entirely within the realms of what you see on the market, the situation is worse, right? And also, if you think about now procedural and dynamically tessellated geometry, things get even trickier. Specifically, some BVHs need to be rebuilt, for example, for tessellations that change topology every frame. Again, I'd like to mention these 12 mesh shaders. They produce lots of small geometry chunks that get drawn on the fly. So how do you deal with BVHing those? Okay, the other thing with BVHs that we face are high BVH memory footprints. So as we've seen, or as I've explained, modern games push a lot of dynamic and procedural geometry. So there is a problem there. Typically, if you look at a dynamic BVH, so basically one that's updatable, you look at something about 60 per 8 bytes of storage in the BVH for a triangle. And that means that these 225 uniquely skinned characters and the animated trees already consume up to 1 gigabyte. And you can see that that sort of memory consumption doesn't really scale well if you want to push even more dynamic geometry. So what about static BVHs then, or static scene elements? They still use about like 30 to 50 bytes per primitive in a BVH of overall storage. And the thing is now that ray tracing or ray trace effects may have rays that can access most of the scene. So it's different than with rasterization, where we just stream or instance stuff that is within a view frustum. You need to actually potentially have most of the scene or all of the scene in the BVH. And as you've seen in the Unreal Engine 5 demo, Unreal Engine 5 scenes are rumored to have billions of triangles. Okay, fair enough, right? I mean, they use very aggressive view-dependent culling to just draw a portion of them to make it look as great as possible. But the question really is, can our current BVH storage, build, update, and streaming technology deal with this? That's an interesting question, and I guess we will see the answer in the future. So, as said before, current AAA games limit or have to limit BVH complexity, and as a result, ray tracing because of these limitations. Okay, so what can we do to solve this in the future, perhaps, other than making GPUs faster in general? So perhaps there's a way to support lossy geometry compression in hardware in a way that BVHs and traversal can work on them. That could be an interesting idea to look into. What about hardware accelerated builds? They have been proposed, and they're certainly an interesting idea. The only thing with this is really the question, how much die space do you want to spend on these building blocks? Because typically, BVH building should only last for a fraction of a frame. And if you have lots of die space lying around, it does this, and it's only active for a fraction of the frame, that's really not a good investment. So what about support for lazy builds? That's being used in the CPU world, CPU side ray tracing a lot, but it really doesn't work well for GPUs because of the programming model. So basically, lazy builds work like this. But the idea behind lazy builds is this, that you only really build or update stuff that's actually reachable by rays. We've actually solved a similar problem with procedural texturing. So perhaps there are ways to deal with this. Okay, obviously the best thing overall would be if we could reduce memory footprint and BVH and refit costs. So specifically for dynamic geometry, could we create a scheme where basically dynamic pieces of geometry get BVH on the fly, and they are put into a cache, and then bundles of ray trace them, and this cache or this portion of memory is then reused for other pieces of geometry? That would be cool. Can we make this work? I don't know. It could be an interesting thing to look into. So let's now talk about coherency and SIMD utilization issues. So the problem with SIMD utilization and ray tracing is this. Let's look at this picture here. So Let's assume you have a GPU that has 4 wide waves, which means you have 4 lanes in a wave. So let's say all these lanes kick off array. Let's say lane 0 has to just enter 1 BVH leaf box to be done with tracing the array. Now lane 1 has to already enter and traverse 2 BVH leaf boxes. Lane 3 has to enter and traverse 3. Okay, lane 3 has to do another, just 1 again. But in the end, you can see as lanes can't go on their own, they need to wait for the longest traversal to come back, which would be lane 2. And that's obviously wasting compute resources to some degree. So how much of a problem is this in real world games? Oh yeah, one thing I wanted to say is that basically, okay, you could say, hey, my latency hiding of the GPU would deal with this anyway. That's like a texture access. We have lots of threads. But the problem is that latency in ray tracing is a lot higher than texture latency. So you'd have to throw a lot more threads at this, which means a lot of more die space. And at the moment, that's not happening. Okay, so as said, we want to look into how much of a real world problem this is, the SIMD latency or the different traversal lengths along the race of a lane. So what we've done is we've captured a complex BVH from a DXR game. We've then basically simulated tracing race into that BVH, and we've basically done statistics to find out what percentage of race take how many traversal steps. So what we found out is that when we simulated GPUs with different SIMD wave sizes, that basically the bigger the SIMD wave size is, the higher actually also is the highest number of traversal steps in the SIMD wave. So basically the problem of lanes waiting for the longest one gets worse with higher SIMD sizes. And this was for camera arrays. Same can be said for AO arrays. We've simulated them as well, and we see very similar results. And you can see that for a 32 wide wave, the highest number of average, or the average number of highest traversal steps already gets close to the sort of the maximum of traversal steps that rays have to take. Okay, let's talk about shader path divergence for a second. That is what happens when basically all lanes come back and they've hit something, but each of them have hit a different material and need to execute a different material shader. Now again, as lanes can't do different things at the same point in time, what you need to do here is you need to run first the green shader, then the purple shader, then the red shader, and then the orange shader. So you're serializing the shader execution, which again is not great because you want to do as many things as possible in parallel. Okay, the final thing that I'd like to mention that has to do with divergence is divergent textures. So again, the situation is this: our arrays have hit stuff, and in this case, they've actually even hit materials that execute the same material shader or the same hit shader. So the shader is fine, but at this point in time, what they have hit may need different textures to actually evaluate the shading model. So again, there's divergence, but it's not divergence execution, but it's divergence in what textures you need to access. This obviously consumes memory bandwidth and can limit your workloads. All right, so what can we do to increase coherency and SIMD utilization? The current solutions are basically sorting based. You sort rays for more traversal coherence, and less SIMD latency. You can sort them by origin plus direction, by Morton code, whatever. There are several ways to sort them, and you hope that your sorting basically makes sure that they hit more, that the hits and traversal are more coherent. Okay, let's say you found your hits. You could then store the hit points either in local shared memory or in global memory, and then later on sort these by material ID or shading model to basically guarantee coherent shading. The thing to realize, though, is that for pervasive ray tracing, we want probably multiple bounces. And for multiple bounces, this approach is quite slow. Specifically, if you're using high local shared memory footprints, then this may limit your occupancy quite significantly and slow you down quite a lot. Okay, so what could a potential future solution look like for this? Could it be something to do with asynchronous ray tracing? So basically, we kick off the rays, we sort of retire the shaders and let the hardware do the tracing, and then come back and bundle coherent shading requests? So what could this look like? It could be something like this. Let's say you have a GPU with a wave width of 2, and you can see here 2 waves on the left, wave 0, on the right, wave 1. The lanes hit different materials and different hit shaders. Could we have hardware that sort of rebundles these shading requests so that basically you end up with waves that run coherent shading requests? This could be interesting and could help with all the sorting, because essentially could probably skip all the sorting and the corresponding memory traffic. All right, another thing I want to briefly talk about is LOD management. LOD management is not easy with current ray tracing hardware and APIs. It's pretty limited, really. A cool thing is that NVIDIA recently has posted a blog that shows how instance masks and ray masks can be used to do LOD crossfading. That's pretty cool. It has apparently limited crossfading capabilities because it basically only can select 1 out of 8 random bits to do the transition. So if you want to go for higher quality transitions, you can program that in the NH shader, but that would be a decision on a per triangle basis and would be a lot slower. If you have LODs that use geomorphing, so something like progressive meshes, that I don't know if anybody has ever done this, but it seems possible that this can be done through, let's say, building the highest LOD and then use refits when you're morphing towards a lower LOD. But again, we know refits are expensive. If you're doing a lot of refits because of dynamic geometry already, this is probably not what you want to do. So what are potential future solutions for this? One is to fully implement fast reversal hardware stage in hardware. So there's this paper about ray traversal with an extended program model, which basically allows you to add a traversal shader stage. And that stage essentially works like this. Similar to an intersection shader, you define boxes. And when a ray enters this box, you basically run a shader, and then that shader could actually say, hey, I'm going to forward that ray into another bottom level acceleration structure or top level acceleration structure. This makes LOD selection easy and very programmable, and it could even do more in terms of more than, let's say, two-stage instancing. All right, the latest thing, or the last thing I want to talk about is alpha testing. And alpha testing is comparatively slow with ray tracing. The problem is it's been used all over the place in rasterization, for foliage and whatnot. So why is it fast with ray tracing? The problem is that the hardware traversal gets interrupted to run a shader that then needs to understand if that hit is valid, if if the alpha value in the text is transparent or not. I don't want to talk too much about this. I'd invite you to see our talk on Wednesday. It's called Subtriangle Opacity Mask for Faster Ray Tracing of Transparent Objects. All right, this pretty much concludes my keynote. I'd like to recognize these people for helping to prepare the slides. And let's switch to...
we have just 2 minutes. Oh. Sorry. Hey. Hello. Okay. So first of all, thanks, Holger. We have about 2 minutes before we need to move on to the next thing. So anybody on the audio here on... feel free to chirp in and ask any questions. Or if we have any questions on Slack, which I don't see any yet. Okay, so I mean, I guess my question is, out of all of these issues that you were listing, which one is the one that like concerns you the most?
To be honest, to me, at the moment, it's really the whole dynamic BVH stuff, because that's really limiting things quite a bit. It really means you need to limit your scenes, and that's the biggest thing for me at the moment.
I was curious, are the scenes instanceable in a way that, in general, that you could try to basically achieve some amount of compression that way?
Yes, you can instance, but all the instancing basically only allows rigid transformations, right? So skinned instancing as such with a different, unique, let's say, bone buffer that drives the skinning, that's not possible. Well, you need to, you can do it, right? But you need to basically stream out the skinned vertices and then update the BVH with that. And that's a two-step process, essentially. You can't do that on the fly. But all rigid stuff is definitely possible. You can definitely repeat objects somewhere, scale and rotate them and stuff like that. That's all possible, yes.
Yeah. I guess I was curious that some of the techniques used for blending for motion blur, they can at least support linear motion throughout, like skinned linear motion. But yeah, it's interesting. Thank you. Right.
I mean, I guess motion blur would be a thing. I mean, that could. I mean, you could keep several things in the BVH and then crossfade between those. That's perhaps possible for some solutions with regards to motion blur, but in general, it's trickier.
Thanks, Warren. Okay, so we're right at 10:45 Pacific time. So I think we should try and keep everybody on schedule. Holger, thank you very much. Holger's slides are online for everybody to review. Just a reminder, all of these pre-recorded talks and the live talks will be available for watching on YouTube hopefully by midday tomorrow. And that for the registered participants, we have the Slack channels that we can continue to asynchronously talk about any of the talks. And the speakers will jump on at certain times to answer any questions that are there. So again, thank you very much, Holger. And I'm going to turn it over to the papers.
All right, shall I go?
Go ahead.
All right. Yes, I'm Marco Lano from UMBC, and I'm going to be chairing this first paper session. We'll kick things off with generalized light portals by Shinji Ogaki from Zozo Research. And I'll let him take it away.
I'll be presenting my paper. Hi, my name is Shinji Ogaki. I'll be presenting my paper titled Generalized Light Portals. Light portals are useful for accelerating the convergence of Monte Carlo path tracing, especially when rendering interiors. Industry standard renders such as Arnold and Renderman support light portals. However, there are a limited number of literature related to light portals, and each one has its own limitation. Normally, shapes are limited to a planar rectangle, and Nao's previous work addresses many portals problem. If you have multiple windows in your scene, placing a portal object around every single window is a tedious task. The goal of this paper is to make light portals user-friendly by supporting arbitrary polygon meshes and arbitrary shapes created by 2D texture maps, such as clip maps. Portals created by textures can be used for a variety of things. For example, we can support a pinhole camera in the path tracing framework. We can also compute illumination from a lantern efficiently. They enable guiding photons as well. The proposed technique is built on these two excellent papers: fast random sampling of triangle meshes and the important sampling of many lights with adaptive tree splitting. Min-max MIP maps are also used to accelerate some computations. If you already have these features in your renderer, the proposed technique can be implemented without a significant effort. This work mainly consists of two parts. In the first part, adaptive tree splitting is extended to support textured mesh lights. In the second part, it is applied to portal sampling. Let's quickly recap adaptive tree splitting. The algorithm starts by building a VVH over lights. Lights that are spatially close and have similar orientations are clustered together using a surface area orientation heuristic. To generate a sample, we traverse the VVH by stochastically selecting a node based on its illumination contribution, which is a product of the total energy of the node and the so-called conservative geometric term. Wide VVHs are used throughout the paper to speed up computation and to avoid constructing a cut. Collapsing a binary VVH into wide VVH is equivalent to creating multiple cuts in the original binary VVH. Nodes that introduce a large amount of error will be removed. As shown here, increasing the RT improves image quality. So how can we support textured mesh lights? A naive approach would be to tessellate an input mesh and build a light VVH over the tessellate triangles. This should work, but memory consumption is of concern because vertex data will be duplicated and the node size of light VVH isn't small. We can avoid this problem by using a two-level data structure. In this paper, the TLAS is a VVH built over triangles, and BLAS is another tree data structure built in pericentric coordinates for each triangle. The node of the BLAS is compact. Of course, we can save more memory by reducing the size of indices or by quantizing float values. When generating a sample, we probabilistically select a child node based on illumination contribution at every traversal step. The irradiance from each node can be approximated with boundary integration. Here, L is the average color of the pixels covered by a node. Unfortunately, this computation is slow because of inverse trigonometric functions, and suffers from numerical errors because tiny triangles are created not only by tessellation, but also by clipping. Instead, we can use a point-to-point form factor. This works, but we have to deal with negative cosine terms. Negative values can be entirely avoided by using this extremely conservative term. This crude approximation works quite well because the TLAS helps picking the right triangle if an input mesh is moderately tessellated. Here is a comparison of three approaches. Each textured polygonal light is made of two triangles. The previous work by Sig et al. Produces noise because it doesn't take into account the geometric term. Boundary integration produces much less noise, but suffers from fireflies. The extremely conservative term gives much better results compared to the previous work, and is more than 2 times faster than boundary integration. To combine this technique with other sampling methods using multiple importance sampling, we need to be able to calculate a probability of a ray hitting a certain leaf. Now let's assume that a ray hit this leaf node. To compute the probability, we deterministically traverse a tree from the root to the leaf. This is normally done using bit trails attached to each leaf node. Alternatively, we can add a parent pointer to each node. The path from the root to the leaf can be expressed using these 4 bits. This works perfectly for binary BVHs. However, this can be a problem for wide BVHs. A wide BVH can be deep when it is not well balanced. So we may need many bits to represent a path because, for example, if we use 16 array BVHs, 4 bits are necessary for each traversal step. Another thing about building a tree in the pericentric coordinates is that neither bit trails nor parent pointers are required to evaluate the probability. The reason is that we can compute the index of child node just from shading points pericentric coordinates using this indexing scheme. Now we are ready to apply the textured mesh light sampling method to light portals. For constant background, we just need to replace emission values by reguiding weights such as transparency. To handle general environment maps, we have to replace the E term in the conservative geometric term by the product of the average transparency of this cluster and the average intensity of pixels covered by the solid angle omega c subtended by the cluster bounding box. Likewise, we have to replace the term L of the extremely conservative term. The average intensity of the pixels covered by omega c is approximated by a map of the environment map that is stored using Kohlberg's equal area parameterization. A 3x3 box filter is applied to each level image to avoid an abrupt change between pixels. Then, the solid angle covered by each pixel is computed using this formula. We can find the mipmap level by rebutting this. If we stop traversal when reaching a leaf node of the BLS, we may fail to capture bright pixels of the environment map. Therefore, we have to keep subdividing a subtriangle until one or both of the following conditions are met. The first condition, we can stop subdividing when the subtriangle covers a single pixel of the environment map. The second condition, we can terminate subdivision if the covered area is constant. In the initialization process, min-max mipmaps are created as well as regular mipmaps. We can quickly check whether the area is constant or not by comparing a pixel's minimum and maximum values. If the values are equal, the covered region can be considered to be constant. Okay, I'd like to show some results. This room is illuminated by light passing through star-shaped windows. The left image is rendered using Lambertian and environment map sampling combined via multiple importance sampling. The right image is rendered with the 3 sampling techniques combined. As you can see, the proposed method helps reducing noise. When portals are large, the effectiveness of portal sampling is reduced. In this example, the thick glass windows are used as light portals. Using portal sampling still is a better result for this scene because the roof of the car blocks the bright part of the sky. A diffuse transmittance material can be assigned to a portal object. A portal light source is placed in the runtime. You can see notable noise reduction. Photon guiding is another interesting application. These images are rendered using 100K photons. With the proposed technique, photons are generated an order of magnitude faster. Since we repeatedly scale random numbers during traversal, the samples generated with the proposed technique are less stratified. The main bottleneck of the presented method is the construction of SIGGRAPH during sampling, especially when the environment map is taken into account. In this paper, Claberg's equal area parameterization is used, but we could use similar ones that are cheaper to evaluate. Our method works when the portals are nested. However, since each sample is drawn stochastically based on its solid angle, transparency, and the intensity of the environment map, its performance can degenerate. For instance, if a wall with a small portal is entirely covered by another wall that has a large portal, many samples will be generated on the large portal object and be wasted. Although our method can be easily combined with other sampling strategies via multiple importance sampling, it will be more efficient to take into account other factors such as BSDFs. We did not consider tiling or procedural textures. Tiling would be easy to support, however, it might increase memory consumption. Supporting patterns defined by implicit functions or resolution-free vector graphics is an interesting future avenue. Our method could be useful for accelerating the learning phase in the path guiding or complex light transport algorithms by finding good initial paths. A variety of VVH optimization techniques, including rotation and restructuring, could be used to improve SAOH-optimized VVHs. I am particularly interested in the rate-specialized contraction method by Gu et al. In summary, a simple sampling technique that works for arbitrary-shaped portals has been proposed. This is based on the computation of illumination from textured mesh lights. Its use is as simple as taking a binary flag attached to a mesh shader. The setup can be even automated if the names of shaders have a prefix such as window. Thank you for your attention.
All right, so I believe we have some time for questions. I'll go ahead and kick things off while others are thinking about what question they might have to ask. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the comparison with boundary integration. What are the artifacts in boundary integration that your method doesn't show? Because at least in the presentation, and maybe this is a problem with the video quality, but I was hard pressed to actually be able to see what the difference was.
So using boundary integration, we have to use clipping polygons. So if the one or two vertex edges clipped, you can easily create very, very tiny triangles. So so calculating the illumination contribution from that tiny triangle can generate fireflies, and it's hard to vectorize.
Yeah, so I'm sure that the fireflies probably don't make it very well through the video compression, so that those artifacts are a little harder to see.
I should have put the close-ups, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Are there other questions? I've got like multiple windows open looking to see if anybody else has a question, but I'm not seeing anything jumping out. So I guess we'll thank the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so so our next talk is efficient adaptive deferred shading with hardware scatter tiles by Ian Mallett, Jem Yüksel of University of Utah, and Larry Saylor of Facebook. Start the talk.
Hi, my name is Ian Mallett. Our paper is about how to implement deferred adaptive compute shading, an adaptive undersampling algorithm we introduced at HPG 2018 into hardware. However, before we jump right in, let's make sure we understand the actual problem these algorithms solve. First, we need to talk about overdraw. Let's say you're a GPU and you're drawing a triangle. You figure out which pixels the triangle covers, and you invoke a fragment shader for each covered pixel. Let's say you have another triangle. It comes in and you do the same. However, it just so happens that some of the pixels in this new triangle are closer than the corresponding pixels in the old triangle, and so they will get overwritten. This is fine so long as calculating the pixel's color is a simple operation. However, in a typical modern application, this is not the case. Indeed, even in highly optimized pipelines, fragment shading is the most expensive part. The industry standard solution to this problem is called deferred shading. In deferred shading, we instead render metadata required to shade the frame. This is called the geometry buffer, or gbuffer, and it typically contains material information, the surface normal vector, and special purpose auxiliary data. The gbuffer suffers overdraw, but because the shaders that generate the gbuffer are simple compared to the full fragment shader, this waste is not anywhere near as problematic. We then take the gbuffer and loop through all the pixels only once, calculating their colors from the metadata. Modulo a few caveats, there is now no overdraw, and so the fragment shader only needs to be invoked just once per pixel. The overwhelming majority of demanding real-time applications are based on deferred shading, and with good reason. The savings can be significant. Although there is extra work required for rendering the gbuffer, the procedure is a net win because when we are running the expensive color calculation, there is no overdraw. It might seem as if we must stop here. After all, we are shading only a single pixel per pixel. How can we possibly do better? However, it is possible to shade fewer pixels by shading only some of the pixels, but then reconstructing the rest of them later by some approximate process. This is called undersampling. We sacrifice a little bit of image quality, and hopefully only a little bit, in exchange for significantly reducing the number of shading operations, potentially to far below 1 shade per pixel. The most well-known category of undersampling methods is called checkerboard rendering. The easiest version to understand just shades half the pixels on one frame and the other half on the next frame. The results are then combined with temporal reconstruction filtering. So now you're only shading half the pixels per frame. Checkerboard rendering has important theoretical limitations, but is widely used in practice in one form or another. At HPG 2018, we introduced Deferred Adaptive Compute Shading, or DAX, which operates differently. First, we shade every 4th pixel in X and Y, or 1 out of every 16 pixels. This forms a low-resolution image. Then, we go over the pixels in the middle. At each pixel, we ask the question, can this pixel be interpolated from its 4 neighbors without introducing too much error? This is just a user-defined heuristic, and in practice, we find that very simple functions work just fine. If we can interpolate the pixel, we just do that and get the color. Voila! We have saved a single shading invocation. However, sometimes we cannot interpolate, and so we do have to shade the pixel. In practice, we don't shade it right then. Because of the way GPU's parallelize work, we instead put it into a buffer of waiting pixels which we flush periodically. But the effect is the same, we still have to shade it. Eventually, all of these pixels have been assigned a color as well. We then proceed recursively. The next level's pixels also have 4 neighbors, and again, we interpolate or shade, saving time whenever we can interpolate. The next 2 levels also are similar. For every one of these pixels in the lower shading levels, we are interpolating whenever possible, which significantly reduces the cost of shading the frame, leading to a commensurate performance improvement. There is also variable rate shading, or VRS, introduced in the NVIDIA Turing architecture. VRS allows for fragment shaders to be run at a lower, or higher, rate than usual. The rates are specified for screen space tiles, potentially on a per triangle basis. For example, look at this screen space tile. Suppose we decide that, within this tile, we should be shading once for every 2 by 4 block of pixels. So, every 2 by 4 block of pixels gets 1 fragment shade, and the color is copied to all 8 fragments. This is repeated for every 2 by 4 block within the tile. There are many different shading rates that can be chosen, currently from 1 shade every 4 by 4 pixels down to 16x supersampling. Unfortunately, this scattering means that when VRS undersamples, you get blocky artifacts. When looking at raw images without the benefit of post-processing to hide these artifacts, we see that VRS has difficulty adapting to local features in the scene, especially in a deferred renderer, where VRS's ability to detect silhouette edges is inapplicable. We can contrast this with DAX. In the same situations, DAX is able to adapt much better to the scene features, producing better results in both silhouette edges and in regions of flat color. DAX isn't perfect, but the result is clearly much better. Both algorithms shade 50% of pixels in these examples. Moreover, the allocation of VRS shading rate was also optimized in an offline process. We have other comparisons and more details in the paper, but these are representative. However, VRS does have an advantage in that it is implemented in hardware, whereas DAX is implemented in a compute shader, which is software. This leads to several important inefficiencies. The first is that accesses to the G-buffer are made both redundant and incoherent. A typical cache line size is 64 bytes, and a typical memory layout is that each cache line corresponds to a 4x4 block of 32-bit pixels. Consider the first shading level. As we walk through the frame buffer, we access only 1 pixel within each cache line, requiring an entirely new cache line for the next pixel. At the next shading level, we have to read it all again. And for the next shading level, again, and again, and again. Therefore, the input G-buffer bandwidth can be inflated by up to a factor of 5. Similarly, writing the output colors into the frame buffer requires 5 writes and 4 reads to access the data from the previous shading levels it must be combined with. These problems could only be partially addressed by using a different layout of the G-buffer and frame buffer in memory, but even so, none of the available memory layouts on current GPUs do much better, and anyway, current graphics APIs allow, at best, only hints about memory layout. We'll come back to this. Perhaps most problematically, the DAX algorithm is, incidentally, specifying a new order for pixels to be shaded in. This is well within the domain of the particulars of how the hardware is designed, and the typical developer does not have the access nor expertise to reason about these considerations. Even worse, this messing about with the pixel shading order is strongly affected by changes the vendor makes to the GPU, such as by changing the driver, making reliable reasoning about performance fundamentally impossible. To demonstrate this, consider 3 different shaders to do the shading pass within deferred shading. First, consider just a simple fragment shader as a baseline. This is the way the shading pass is typically done. The order the pixels are shaded in is determined by the hardware, and more generally, by the vendor and their driver. It is quite efficient. Next, consider a simple compute shader. With a compute shader, we, the developers, are now responsible for defining a large part of the order in which the pixels are shaded. An obvious approach is to break the frame buffer up into tiles and shade each tile as a work group. This seems, after all, to be roughly what the fragment shader is doing, right? We can't predict exactly what order the groups are scheduled in, and one must consider different tile sizes in order to ensure that the GPU can still do latency hiding. Yet, in the end, it turns out not to matter very much. No matter what we try, it turns out that this approach is about half the speed of the simple fragment shader. However, this is not a fundamental limitation of compute shaders. Instead of immediately dividing the frame buffer up into tiles, we use a global counter to distribute tiles in scanline order to thread groups that request a new tile to work on. This actually turns out to be 50% faster than a fragment shader. We might expect the compute shader to be a little bit faster because it bypasses some particular pieces of overhead, but not by this much. What of the performance of DAX, which adds undersampling and is much more complicated? Well, in 2018, for a typical scene, we measured it at more than 4 times faster than the fragment shader, mostly due to a low shading rate. Now, in 2020, for the same scene, view, and shading rate, it barely breaks even, while shading all the pixels is twice as slow. All of these numbers are correct as of now on a current GPU with up-to-date software, but they will almost certainly change in the future. What these results demonstrate is not any kind of absolute, but instead that the performance of software implementations of the shading order is unreliable, and we cannot expect to implement such things in software and reason about how they perform. There is too much influence from the vendor software, and in any case, it is a job for the hardware to do anyway. For these reasons, in this paper we propose a possible hardware implementation of DAX based on existing GPUs. Our first contribution is to propose an alternate memory layout for the G-buffer. Because pixels are shaded in different shading levels, it makes sense to collect all pixels from each shading level together into contiguous cache lines. Consider a 16 by 16 block. To shade the first level requires 16 G-buffer accesses. However, we can rearrange it such that it only requires 1. Whee! This is called a swizzle pattern. With this pattern, each cache line stores G-buffer data from only a single level, so that the G-buffer data is only read once. GPUs already do these transformations, so implementing this in hardware should be fairly straightforward. However, the gains could be significant. We simulated the effect this improved memory coherency would have on hardware by doing the swizzling in software before the shading pass and observing how the performance of the DAX algorithm was affected. We observed a small but significant performance increase that was consistent across different scenes, resolutions, and shading rates. See the paper for details. However, even if the memory access is optimized, we're still doing 1 pass for each shading level, and therefore making too many accesses overall. Ideally, we would read only once the entire G-buffer within a small, localized region that can fit on chip, do all of the shading at all shading levels, and then write the finished colors out only once to the frame buffer. At first, however, it seems that this is impossible. If you divide the frame buffer up into tiles and try to shade with DAX within each tile, you find that pixel information needs to cross between tiles. For example, consider this pixel in the 3rd level. To calculate the interpolated color, or even to decide whether the pixels need to be interpolated, we need to access the neighboring tile. This defeats the whole purpose. It turns out that sharing data between tiles is unavoidable with the DAX shading order. However, we realized that this is not a big deal so long as we are careful about how we do it. Therefore, we introduce a new kind of on-chip tile that respects the DAX shading order. The tile's shape is irregular and contains holes and islands. The islands fit into the holes of neighboring tiles such that the tiles interlock and fill space. The tile can be readily divided into 4 regions, a main central region, and 3 border regions. The main region scales quadratically, while the 3 border regions together scale only linearly. This means that it is possible to have a relatively large number of border regions fit on chip. The shading process proceeds by looping over the tiles. For each tile, we load the G-buffer only once, run the standard DAX shading order to completion within the tile, and then write the colors out only once to the frame buffer. The dependencies between tiles are handled by the border regions. After the tile is written out to the frame buffer, the main region can be deallocated on chip. However, we retain the border regions until the neighboring tiles are also completed. The neighboring tiles depend on the border regions, and this data is passed entirely on chip to the thread group that is processing that tile. Since the border regions are small compared to the main regions, retaining many border regions on chip is not an issue. Besides dramatically reducing memory traffic, using tiles has the further advantage that we better utilize caching resources. The entire region is shaded at once, meaning that the necessary gbuffer data can be streamed essentially perfectly, and any extra texture accesses done during shading are likely to touch similar data within the scene because of spatial locality. With these changes, we believe that DAX could be made to work very efficiently in hardware. Adding a new memory swizzling pattern should not be too difficult, since GPUs already do this, and exposing memory swizzling patterns to the developer is something that should be done anyway, since it helps them reason and learn about how memory affects their application. The more significant changes relate to implementing our on-chip tiling scheme. However, the main required resource, special purpose cache space, even accounting for appropriate latency hiding factors, still works out to be fairly small. Indeed, it could be shared with memory used for other purposes in non-DAX modes. For example, in a tiled renderer, this cache basically already exists, and the only change is accessing it differently. The DAX algorithm also can be extended in various ways. In the paper, we also discuss extensions for frame rate stabilization, temporal filtering, and a suggested API for exposing this functionality to developers. Implementing DAX into hardware would significantly improve its reliability and make it more practical for developers to use in their applications. Thanks for watching.
All right, we have time for a few questions. I'm going to go ahead and start with one of my own. You are sharing the border pixels between regions, but part of the benefit of DAX is that you can avoid a significant amount of shading. So I'm wondering if it would be still a performance improvement if you just reshaded those border pixels to break the connections between the tiles rather than having the communication between the tiles be necessary.
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. We thought of doing something like that actually in earlier versions when we were iterating on this, and there's actually nothing wrong with it. It's just a design choice. We thought that it would be more interesting if we could pass the data between tiles.
Maybe I can add a couple of things to that. This is a very, very good question. And this is a question that we actually kept coming back to. And we thought, like, should we do this? Should we not do this? The thing is, if you actually shade those pixels, then you don't have to communicate. But maybe you're shading a pixel that you didn't have to shade, so there's that. Or maybe you're shading a pixel that you've already shaded, so you're maybe shading that pixel twice. So there's this extra cost. So what we realize is that it's based on the scheduling, it's very likely that another thread, the thread that's responsible for shading that pixel, already started shading that pixel earlier. So instead of shading it, we can do something else that could be useful and then get back to it and get the data from that thread. But what you mentioned there is actually very, very important. That definitely adds some communication. So, and we're hoping that our assumption here is that the cost of shading is more expensive than passing that result between threads.
Another thing that is worth noting is that the pixels in the tile, there are a lot of pixels in the tile. And so you can, to some extent, perhaps rearrange the pixels within the tile such that you end up shading the pixels that are required by the neighboring tiles sooner than the other pixels in the tile. So therefore, you might have the pixels available for the neighbor tiles to access before moving on to other pixels, and so you can sort of get around these issues. Another thing that we sort of glossed over in the talk, but which is discussed in the paper, is that you have to have latency hiding for tiles. So there's some design space about how many tiles you need to have for each multiprocessor to have appropriate latency hiding. So you need to have more than one tile anyway, and potentially a lot of this passing the data between the tiles is actually passing the data within a multiprocessor, so it's actually very fast.
Cool, thanks. So I'll ask a question from online, asking if you know of any research in doing the interpolation and shading decision in YUV space instead of in RGB space. It's a little outside the scope of your project, but does impact how well DAX would work.
I don't know of any work that does that particularly, although this is sort of color metric, so I'm not really the right person to ask about that. But it is worth noting that the color space you choose does matter. So we considered two spaces in the paper. We considered sRGB, which is 8-bit, red, green, blue. But we also thought about HDR, which has more pixels, and therefore the caching, the sizes of the cache lines as they correspond to blocks of pixels is different. And the swizzling pattern might be slightly different also. So I don't know how this would affect the image quality per se, but it has architectural ramifications.
Okay, yeah. So one more question is there any particular consideration or cost for synchronization between the DAX passes?
Right. So in the original DAX paper, a lot of the reviewers were sort of concerned about this as well. And the answer turns out to be, generally speaking, no. If you have a very simple image that has almost no shading required, then yes, you can get sort of synchronization between the DAX passes that can cause problems. But the problems that they cause are not like the algorithm completely fails. What happens is you get minor image artifacts and you get temporal instability and things like this. So these were actually included in all of our results that we discussed in that paper concerning the SSIM numbers and error metrics and such like. So yes, you can think about synchronization as something that you might want to think about doing, but it turns out not really to be that necessary in practice.
All right, thanks. I think we can move on to our third and final paper in this session. With late input sampling improves aiming under high latency conditions. This paper is by Juwon Kim, IRLL Knowles, Joseph Spiot, Ben Boudard, and Morgan McGuire, all from NVIDIA.
Hi, I'm Juwon Kim from NVIDIA, and the title of my talk is Post-Render Work with Late Input Sampling Improves Aiming Under High Latency Conditions. It's a long title and difficult to read even to me, but the motivation of our work is simple, was how to hide latency in cloud gaming. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. We constantly run this perception action cycle when interacting with the world. Here I have my son playing with a soccer ball. He has to see the ball to perceive the position and motion and take an action to kick it. So that's perception action loop or cycle. And the same is true when you are playing a video game. Here I'm playing a shooter game where I perceive opponent's position and motion and try to align the central aiming point with the opponent. Most motor tasks involve multiple iterations of the perception action cycle because you need to make corrective movements. Latency is important because it affects each perception action cycle, So if you have a system that's 30 milliseconds slower, your game performance is slower not by 30 milliseconds, but by a multiple of 30 milliseconds. So if you like competitive video games, which is a big part of today's gaming industry and culture, then you really want to minimize latency to maximize chance of winning. The input to output latency in computers is typically 20 to 50 milliseconds in today's desktop gaming. This number may sound small, but it's not really small compared to the reaction time of humans, which is typically 100 to 200 milliseconds. Cloud gaming lengthens input to output latency even further. Now the streaming client or the computer has to send the user input to streaming server and then receive the output from the streaming server and then present it to the player. The overall latency on the computer side is now 80 milliseconds in the best case scenario, but it can go up to 200 to 300 milliseconds depending on the network condition. This can significantly hurt player performance and experience, and this is a very important problem to solve. So we thought, what if we use the late sampled input to modify the output received from the streaming server and present it to the user? We call this idea late warp, and we wondered whether it can effectively reduce input to output latency down to the level of local gaming. The technical idea itself is not new. It has been pioneered for head-mounted display viewers to keep up with the fast head rotation made by human viewers. However, the motivation has been limited to viewer comfort of head-mounted displays, and our interest here is in gamer performance. There are many options for doing the work. Let's say this is the image that we received from the streaming server, and this game is a first-person perspective game. And let's say my input sample indicates my late sample input indicates that I turned to the right and up. And the rotation warp will remap the pixels toward to the left and down, as shown here. But note that the new image will contain view directions that were not present in the base image, which is left as gray pixels here. We call this guard band artifacts. But guard band artifacts can be solved, and there are many ways to solve it. The streaming server can draw a larger base image or provide some geometry information to the streaming client so that it can reconstruct the missing views. And if it's done well, then it will look like this. We can also work for player translation as well. Now, this is a harder problem because motion parallax introduces occlusion or disocclusion artifacts. But there are many approaches to solve this problem as well. And you can infer, for example, 3D information from the scene, or you can send a set of images so that the streaming client can do intermediate view reconstruction, or you can send geometry information here again to the streaming client so that it can reconstruct the new geometry. Whichever way you take, as a result, if done well, the rendered image will look like this. And here the view position is now shifted to the right. So as can be seen here, there are a lot of options, each coming with its own pros and cons. Then how to choose the best one? This is a really hard question because there are so many things to consider. There can be effects on player performance, effects on player perception, and complexity of implementation, and many more. So we decided that we cannot estimate all these, but we can focus on one important question and provide a concrete answer to help others make wise decisions. And that was the goal of our user study. So the first important question to our view was player performance. It is the most important thing to competitive video game players. For example, they gladly sacrifice image quality to reduce latency. If late warp does not help with player performance, gamers would not bother to turn it on. So we are going to measure the effect on player performance, and we chose to do it on a shooter game. Shooter game is a genre where player performance is arguably the most sensitive to latency, and there's no hope for late work if it fails in shooter games. And next, we choose conditions to test. As mentioned before, there are so many warp methods, and we cannot test them all. Instead, we decided to test a few representative conditions that will provide us the most insight. The first condition was the baseline condition, where latency was set to a typical value of today's cloud gaming, was 105 millisecond condition. The second condition was rotation naive condition. This condition was inspired by the naive rotation warp, and it had the same latency as in the 105 millisecond condition, except that the player rotation was updated according to a late sampled input. This condition also contained the worst case scenario for guardband artifact. We left all the pixels blank if it was coming from outside of the view frustum of the base image. The third condition was rotation oracle condition. This condition represented the best case scenario for rotation warp. Everything was the same as in rotation naive condition, except that the guardband artifact is now completely removed. Any practical or imperfect solutions to guardband artifact will correspond to an interpolation between rotation naive and rotation oracle. The next condition was translation rotation oracle condition. Everything was the same as in rotation oracle, except that player translation was also updated according to late sampled input. By comparing rotation oracle and translation rotation oracle, we can answer the question, is it important to reduce latency on player translation? The last condition was 25 millisecond condition, which is the best latency of today's desktop gaming setups. Player performance in this condition represents the player performance upper limit of any improvements made by late work conditions. With these 5 conditions, we tried to learn as much as possible about the weakness of the late work methods. While playing our shooter games, the players were sometimes forced to move while shooting in some cases. This was to measure any side effect of the inconsistent latency between player rotation and translation. We also varied the predictability of target motion. Players may learn how to cope with the inconsistent latency between translation and rotation, and it may work well when target motion is predictable, but it will be much harder when target motion is unpredictable. So we expected these 2 things to make a significant difference in player performance. And here is a top-down view of the layout of our user study, which was a simple shooter game. So it's a square room where 2 semi-transparent walls were located in the middle. The player and the target were located across the walls, and these semi-transparent walls were not destroyable. You could see through them, but you could not shoot through them. The target made motion as indicated by this arrow, and sometimes it went behind the walls. And then the player was also allowed to move sideways, and the player sometimes had to move sideways in order to shoot at the target through the gap between the 2 walls. And we varied the separation between the 2 walls to control the amount of player movement. The task was to clear the target as quickly as possible. This is a video showing our participant playing the game. As you can see, the target sometimes went behind the wall, and the player moved to keep it visible through the gap so that he can continue to shoot at it. 9 gamers, 21 to 34 years old, 1 female and 8 males participated, and we gave an orientation before starting the experiment where we explained to them about the task and the 5 warp condition. You may wonder why we explained about the 5 warp conditions. This was actually a consciously made decision. If late warp is applied to real game, it's very likely that the knowledge about late warp will be also available to the gamers. We wanted to measure player performance that reflects this realistic scenario as closely as possible So we did the same thing for our participants. It was a 5 days experiment. One warp condition was tested per each day, which included both training and data collection sessions. And a total of 1,500 trials were performed per participant. It took about 2 hours to complete all the conditions. The ordering of the 5 warp conditions were counterbalanced across participants. Participants were not informed of the ordering or the particular condition they were in. Nevertheless, they were able to notice 105 millisecond condition and rotation naive condition because they were very obvious. But the other 3 conditions were subtle and were not clearly identified. This was a very useful know-how while we were running an esports user study. This is a scoreboard that was displayed in our esports research lab. This was very effective in motivating the participants. For example, they were taking photos when they scored higher than their colleagues. But more importantly, this was also very useful and helpful in minimizing perceptual bias in the experimental data. Some conditions were noticeably annoying, but all the participants tried their best in all the conditions. So now let's look at the data. The horizontal axis has the 5 warp conditions tested. And on the vertical axis is task completion time, where lower number means better performance. So let's first see the player performance in the baseline condition and the performance upper limit condition. It took about a second longer to clear the target in 105 millisecond condition or the baseline condition, compared to 25 millisecond condition or the performance upper limit condition. Now the real question is, what's the performance look like in the 3 late warp conditions in the middle? If the trend follows this red arrow, then late warp harms player performance and we don't need to pursue this idea further. If the trend follows this green arrow, then late warp improves player performance and has potential to become a very important technique for latency reduction. And this was the real data. It's very close to the green arrow that I just showed you. When we ran statistical tests, 105 millisecond condition was the only condition that significantly differed from other conditions. All the other conditions did not significantly differ from each other. And we incrementally added features when we chose the conditions, which is now really useful in estimating the contribution of each element in late warp conditions, late warp techniques. The condition rotation naive made player rotation responsive, which added the most value to player performance. Condition rotation oracle solved guardband artifact, but it only added minor improvements to player performance. Condition translation rotation oracle made player translation responsive, but added only a minor improvements. And finally, condition 25 milliseconds, or the performance upper limit condition, where all the remaining latency problems were solved, again provided only a minor improvement. Now let's look at the effects of the wall separation. The player had to move a lot at the narrowest wall separation, 0.5 meter, and did not have to move at all at the widest wall separation, or 10 meters. We expected to see a wider separation between rotation-only warp and translation rotation warp as players make more movements. But they were similar for all wall separations. Now let's look at the effect of target motion predictability. Again, we expected to see a wider separation between rotation-only warp and translation rotation warp as target motion becomes more unpredictable. But they were, again, similar for both predictable and unpredictable target motion. Now let me summarize the findings from our experiment. Late warp eliminated most of player performance penalty due to 80 milliseconds of added latency. And more surprisingly, even the simplest warp eliminated 80% of the player performance penalty due to added latency. And it was interesting to learn that guardband artifact hardly hurted player performance. Guard band artifact is largely a perceptual problem according to this study. This is going to be very useful information for game developers when they make decisions for real products. Latency effects differed by movement or input type. In our experiment, rotation latency was more important than translation latency. From the user interface point of view, rotation is controlled by continuous input on the mouse, and translation is controlled by discrete input on keyboard. Our finding may suggest that latency on continuous input is more critically important for user performance than latency on discrete input. Now we are coming back to our initial motivation, how to reduce latency in cloud gaming. We learned that late warp can do it, but this is only the beginning of a very complex problem. Here is an example. In this screenshot of a first-person shooter game, there are many 2D UI elements that are locked on screen space, which should not be warped. Then you may guess that, is it the solution to warp only the 3D content, but not 2D content? Unfortunately, no. There are these 2D UI elements that must be fixed in the world space, and they must be warped. And there's this 3D content, the weapon that the player is holding, which should stay fixed on the screen. However, the reflection on the weapon surface should change because lighting conditions change due to the warp. So there are many things here, but this is only just one screenshot, and there will be many more problems out there. So implementing late warp in real games is not a trivial task at all. It is a major rework across the entire gaming pipeline. But as our study showed, the return will be huge if it's done correctly. Thank you very much for your attention, and here are photos of the wonderful collaborators who made this study possible, and we will be all online to take any questions. Thank you.
All right. I think we have time for a few questions. And once again, I'll start with one of my own. Seems like you've got a pretty complex experimental setup with a lot of extra variables, wall separation, predictable versus unpredictable. Is there, was 9 participants enough or could some of the lack of significant differences be due to not having enough participants for as many experimental variables as we had?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So we had collected 1,500 trials. So we tried to cope with the significance level by having many more trials than expanding the number of subjects. Although expanding number of subjects is always a good thing to do. We achieved the enough significance level for the main effect that we wanted to find answer to, but there are very clear trends that RN, RO, TRO, or 25 milliseconds, they are progressively getting better in terms of player performance. And by having more subjects or collected more data on trials, I think we could have gotten the more stronger significance level. But yeah, please note that we got the significance level for the most important question that we wanted to answer.
Thanks. Another question from online, this is on the Twitch, was how large on average in pixel or screen percentage was the guard band artifact, and was that a distraction to the gamers?
It was definitely a distraction, and they started to complain at the beginning of the experiment. There was another, let me first answer this question. So the percentage we didn't measure quantitatively. My feeling is it sometimes goes to 30-40%, but only very briefly, maybe just 1 or 2 frames. It was the 60 hertz condition refresh rate. But by averaging out, I would guess 5% maybe was not very large. Then there was another related question on Twitch, that whether player performance over the guardman artifact condition deteriorated over time worse than other methods. We didn't take a closer look at that, but I guess the concern there is whether visual fatigue affects player performance. My feeling is that during the 30 minutes of per session time, it didn't affect player performance noticeably, but maybe in much longer time period, like 1 to 2 hours because of the restriction. But yeah, it feels like it didn't affect player performance. We can take a closer look at it.
Okay, thanks. So it looks like that's all the questions that we have right now. So thanks to all of the speakers for this session. And I guess this is the end of today's sessions. I assume there's maybe some announcements from the organizers. And we'll see everybody tomorrow for tomorrow's sessions.
Thanks. Thanks, Mark. I don't know if any of the other chairs have general announcements. One thing I will say is a pro tip that I've gotten is that you can watch the Twitch stream on a TV, and that tends to go over well. So you can stream HPG on a TV from your couch, but no general announcements other than that.